Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in public law. We're continuing talking about the concept of judicial review, in this lesson, specifically the grounds for judicial review, and even more specifically, the idea of proportionality in relation to judicial review. Now, the concept of proportionality is going to be the topic of this next few lessons. But as just a basic recap, what we did in the previous videos was look at the concept of irrationality judgment in judicial review cases. Specifically, we delineated, I apologize, between the concept of irrationality, procedural impropriety, and the ideas of things related to Wensbury unreasonableness on the one hand, and then we applied these specific considerations to applications involving human rights on the other hand, which is of course a separate and distinct conversation that we had. Now, this lesson is going to start talking about the concept of proportionality. Noting in the previous lesson, by the way, as a basic understanding, is that the traditional test of Wensbury unreasonableness does not necessarily provide adequate protection for cases concerning human rights. This lesson, as I've said, is going to talk about the concept of proportionality. Now, the concept of proportionality is going to relate to a number of different principles here. This is the final major element relating to grounds for judicial review. A lot of different issues are going to be discussed. Things like procedural impropriety, things like legitimate expectations and natural justice will also be examined before we then park our understanding in our conversations about the grounds for judicial review and start talking about some of the applications of administrative law, specifically examining the idea of police powers. So let's begin then. Proportionality. Fundamentally, a judicial review claim that involves human rights will involve allegations of an individual's right being limited in a particular context, or potentially it could be a plurality of rights. Multiple rights may be violated or allegedly be violated. The state, in limiting the rights, then have to show, by way of a proportionality test, some kind of justification for the particular government policy or particular local action in limiting that right. So they must perform a proportionality assessment in order to ensure that the decision to impose some kind of limitation on rights does not go beyond the intended effect of the public decision. So fundamentally, if I was a local authority, or I was the government, or I was a government department that had a certain amount of administrative function, and I was implementing a policy, and I implemented a policy, and maybe I have good grounds and I have good reasonable reasons for implementing this policy. I might think that it aligns more with the mandate of the people, or maybe on national security grounds, whatever. And in doing so, I know that this might produce a limitation or involve a potential limitation on certain human rights in particular contexts. In order for this to be valid, or the first thing I need to do is make sure that the intended effect of this policy does not overly and disproportionately limit the human rights of an individual in that particular context. So when looking at proportionality in decisions, there must be a reasonable relationship between the objective that is sought to be achieved by that policy and the means by which they are going to go about implementing that policy. So when the idea of proportionality is therefore discussed, and when a decision is actually then challenged, those who bring a judicial review claim are not making an argument that the end goal or the objective is necessarily illegal or irrational, which is of course the previously examined two claims for judicial review, two grounds for judicial review. Rather, you're making an argument that in the course of conduct, the method by which the achievement of that goal has been achieved is unjustified, is not proportional to the end goal itself, and may disproportionately impact the human rights and individual rights of people involved in that decision. Let's begin then by looking at quite a major case in determining proportionality, which is the case of Bank Mellat versus Her Majesty's Treasury, the second version from 2013. What this case does is confirm certain previous cases that I'm not going to examine here because this is really just the culmination in those cases. And it approved that the test for proportionality will have four distinct features, sometimes known as limbs, the limbs of the proportionality test. There will be four major limbs of this test. These are not perfect, nor do they have definitive conclusions in regarding the interpretation of this test. But this was essentially, in terms of examining the case itself, it was a case which involved the imposition of financial restrictions on Bank Mellat by Her Majesty's Treasury. So Her Majesty's Treasury obviously representing a public body, a public authority. They did so on the grounds that the bank itself was involved in the financing of the Iranian nuclear program, which of course the government had a policy of being strongly opposed to, and as they should. Now, they argued that the bank themselves, in fact, argued that the banning of or the imposition of financial restrictions on the bank for this reason was actually in contravention of their Protocol 1 rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 1 of Protocol 1 concerns the right to property as well as the right to the enjoyment of business. So essentially, you are limiting our ability to do business and our right to property under the ECHR by limiting and placing financial restrictions on us. The question for the Supreme Court, therefore, was whether or not this decision to limit the finances was actually proportional to the policy to be achieved. The policy to be achieved was, of course, to maintain that there is financial restrictions on those who finance Iranian terrorism or finance Iranian nuclear programs. And so the question had to be asked for the Supreme Court. The goal of the Treasury, of course, is to hinder the development of the Iranian nuclear program. This is a goal which was enshrined in statute, and it was a statutory goal, so you also bear in mind, of course, the fact that parliamentary sovereignty exists here. And so the result here is asking the question of whether or not those financial restrictions that were imposed, whether or not those financial restrictions, in fact, were proportionate. The Supreme Court held that they were not proportionate, and as a result of which the decision was unlawful. And so, in making a determination of proportionality, the Supreme Court, specifically headed, the judgment was headed by Lord Sumption, came up with a number of tests for determining proportionality. This was the four-stage test. And this test involved the first question, which is, given a limitation of a right, was the objective of the policy sufficiently important? So you're asking the question of importance in relation to this policy. That's the first point that you have to ask. The next was the measure for implementation rationally connected to this objective? So it seems to make sense that it was rationally connected if the policy and the goal and the end goal is to hinder the development of the Iranian nuclear program. Then if you believe that a bank is financing Iranian nuclear technology, then imposing financial restrictions on them was of course going to be rationally connected to that objective. The third point, which is probably the most controversial point, is, quote, could there have been an alternative measure imposed which was less intrusive? This is one of the major questions that has to be asked, okay? It is not necessarily dismissing the goal of the policy or even necessarily the validity of going after the bank in question, but more so attacking the validity of the process, attacking the validity of the ways in which essentially the government or the Treasury, in fact, went about trying to impose these restrictions. Could they have done so in a different way, which was less intrusive, but still maintained and achieved the same goal? And then finally, is there a fair balance which has been struck between the claimant's rights and the public interest? So remember that there is a balance that has to be made between the public interest and the claimant's rights, such that you can restrict the claimant's rights in relation to the achievement of a public interest. And there has to be a balance there. It has to be proportionate. It can't be disproportionate in that particular goal, in the aim for that. Fundamentally, when it comes to debating these different points, the third consideration is arguably the most heavily debated one, the one that will attract the most debate for most circumstances, and you can understand why, given the nature of the third consideration. Because what Sumption argues in applying this third consideration is that a measure would be disproportionate if any more limited measure could be imposed which achieves the same goal. So let's say if you had a choice of two measures, both measures achieve the same goal, and one is more limited, less restrictive, and easier to achieve than the other one, then you would argue that you would go for the less intrusive goal to achieve proportionality. And any other goal would be disproportionate. That's what Sumption argues. Lord Reid, on the other hand, concludes that the third consideration refers to the reasonableness of the measure to be imposed. So, to what extent is the measure imposed reasonable given the circumstances? Both of which are obviously potentially valid considerations that can be made. But fundamentally, what this does is it reflects the ways in which we can understand how proportionality is achieved in these various circumstances and in these different cases.